Number 10. Jean Grey was resting the whole time. After Jean Grey died as part of the Phoenix Saga, everyone was left flabbergasted. During the story, we'd seen Jean merge with the Phoenix Force, become insanely powerful, lose control over this power, become corrupted and dark, basically become a huge supervillain, and finally sacrifice herself, knowing that if she didn't, it would only end badly. Or worse than badly, because it was already pretty bad. Jean Grey, one of the original X-Men team, was dead. Or so it seemed. Later on, Marvel would want to revive the original X-Men team and bring them together on a new team and comic series called X-Factor. So Jean needed to come back to life. But hey, she was dead. So we got the added story to explain that the version of Jean that had died wasn't really her, but was a separate entity known as Phoenix. Sort of this merged thing. Wasn't really Jean. Jean herself was resting comfortably in a pod beneath the ocean, still lived, and would be able to return. Yay. Number 9. Tony Stark was adopted. Yep, that's a thing that happened. I'm just wondering if this one will show up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I can't deny that if we get an Arno as a result, an Arno Stark, I would actually not be too upset with that, even though this retcon's pretty weird. The reason this retcon was such a terrible retcon for Tony was that his parents and their loss always remained a great catalyst and huge emotional plot point for him. Now, of course, just because he was adopted doesn't mean that he can't still love his parents as much as he did and still be as emotionally affected by their death. That's not what I'm saying. But his parents also had a naturally born son that they hid from Tony, who was born before they adopted Tony, and he also didn't know that he was even adopted. Also, there were aliens and alien tech involved in Arno's birth, which explains why this all had to be a secret, but also it's just a lot. All in all, this revelation greatly changed the way Tony saw his parents and made their relationship more complex. And I don't know if either of those things needed to happen. Number 8. Hail Hydra. One of the most shocking moments in Marvel's comic history was when it was revealed that Captain America was actually a sleeper agent for Hydra the whole time. Say what? The guy who for years was diametrically opposed to Hydra and all their beliefs, who had tried and succeeded to foil their plots countless times, was a Hydra agent? How could this be? Well, apparently all those wins were a part of his doing a very good job to convince us all and trust him so that he could stab us in the back at the right moment and take over America, becoming Hydra Supreme. Fortunately, this evil version of Captain America would later be revealed to have been created by Kobik, a living sentient version of the Cosmic Cube who was manipulated into making this retcon happen. What's more, the true Captain America still existed within the shards of the Cosmic Cube and would return once more to defeat his evil self, fixing the timeline. So, I mean, at least this retcon ended up not staying permanent, but still, it's pretty weird. Number 7. Zorn. Okay, so I was actually going to make the title of this point a little more explanatory, but then I realized how long that would actually make the title of this point. Okay, so Zorn was basically a character who showed up in the comics who was a mutant who always needed to wear a mask. Because of this, we never saw Zorn's face, leading many to wonder who was really under the mask. Although I think most people just thought, well, it's probably a new mutant, because you know, we get new mutants added to the comics every day. But no, of course, this is comics, so it had to be someone. In a dramatic twist, it was Magneto. But no, of course, this is comics, so it had to be someone that we already knew. In a dramatic twist, it was revealed to be Magneto, who had infiltrated Xavier's school in order to rally up mutant support and help him create an army. He then destroyed New York, shot Emma Frost, killed Jean, and was eventually killed by Wolverine. Later on, however, Magneto would turn up again because, well, he's Magneto, and writers wanted to inch him closer to that line between villain and anti-hero again, so they basically retconned Magneto's involvement in all of this. It turns out there was a real Zorn, and it was actually Zorn's brother impersonating Zorn, impersonating Magneto, who was really to blame. Wow. Just wow. Number 6. Ugly equals evil. That's what Thanos' retcon taught us. Yep. Thanos' backstory was added in detail in the series Thanos Rising, and what many fans were surprised to learn was that his mother was apparently driven mad by her newborn baby's hideous appearance, and because of his appearance, claimed that she needed to kill him. That's pretty terrible. She sensed basically that because he was ugly, he would also be supremely evil. And the really shocking part of this was, of course, that she was right. But also, what the heck? Just because you don't like the look of your baby doesn't mean it should deserve to die. Fortunately, a retcon was later added to fix this when it was changed to it not being the baby's appearance but to a specific deviant gene in the child's genetic code that concerned both of his parents instead. Still, not great, just analyzing your baby's genes and being like, we already know you're gonna be evil. But it's better than it just being about the ugliness in appearance as the pure reason for condemnation, I guess. Number 5. Doom is never wrong. Some people like Dr. Doom a little too much. I'm probably guilty as being one of those people. To the point that they can't let him be flawed. Doom must be perfect. Well, while Doom may believe that, the reality is it's his flaws that actually help to make him such a great character, and also are important because they are a part of the reason for his villainous nature. Originally, his vendetta started against the Fantastic Four, and more specifically Reed Richards, years ago, when Reed tried to give him pointers on a device he was building. Reed warned Doom that it was unstable, but Doom didn't listen. The device ended up exploding because, well, Richards had been right, scarring Doom's face. Unable to blame himself due to his huge ego, Doom decided to blame Reed, and thus a villain was born. However, retcons have come into play a few times in regards to his origins as to whose fault the device exploding really was. In one retcon, it's actually implied that it's Mephisto's fault, but if that's true, then why has Doom hated Reed so much for pretty much forever? Another retcon implied that Ben Grimm possibly intentionally sabotaged Doom's machine, which is an even worse retcon because it makes Grimm, normally a very lovable character, look like a jerk. Both of these retcons help to buff out Doom's flaws at the expense of making his feuds illogical. Number 4. Peter and MJ's marriage never happened. During the story One More Day, Peter made a pact with Mephisto to ensure that his Aunt May would live. Part of this deal was also that people would forget Peter's secret identity, which was currently out in the open. Although it wasn't like a bargain part of the deal, it was just a thing that would happen. But what did Mephisto want in return for this? Peter to never be a hero again? Did he want his soul? No. No, 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 no. He wanted his marriage? Mephisto wanted to take Peter's marriage to MJ. And by that, I don't mean that he wanted himself to marry MJ, which would actually make, in a weird turn of events, more sense. I mean, he wanted to make it so that their marriage never existed. This was such a strange request that many were left speechless when Peter agreed, and this actually happened. What was likely really going on is that Marvel no longer wanted Peter to be married. Or Joe Quesada never wanted Peter to get married in the first place. They wanted to return to the days when Peter was flying free and single, so this story happened to erase it. Number 3. Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy's relationship. This little frightening retcon was added during the Sins Past story. It also made Peter look like an insensitive jerk, just for good measure as well. The story here that was added in was that Gwen Stacy had an affair with Norman Osborn, a man who was much older than her at the time and who would go on to be responsible for her death. This affair resulted in Gwen becoming pregnant with twins, which she secretly gave birth to. Norman then raised these children, lying to them that they were actually the children of Spider-Man and Gwen, and that Spider-Man had killed their mother, turning them into misguided villains. This was not a retcon anyone needed, but hey, it was one that we got. Number 2. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were never mutants. If you have been subscribers to our channel for a while, then you likely saw this one coming from a mile away. A list of the worst retcons with Amanda hosting it? I wonder what she's gonna rank high up on that list. And you were right. One of the worst retcons in mutant history for me will always be this. During the events of Axis, it was revealed that Wanda Maximoff and her brother Pyotr, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver respectively, were never the children of Magneto, and as such, never mutants. Instead, we learned that the High Evolutionary abducted them when they were young, experimented on them, and then disguised them as mutants and returned them back to the world. Why? Well, we don't really know, which is part of the reason this is such a terrible retcon. That, and it erased years of meaningful family drama and history, and created a bunch of plot points that no longer really made any sense. Number 1. Snap Wilson. Even worse than my own personal nerd rage towards the retcon of the Maximoff twins, everyone's outrage, my own included, against this retcon. I still can't believe this was a thing that even happened in the comics. Oh my goodness. Sam Wilson in the comics became a good friend of Captain America and was even known as his ally, the superhero Falcon. However, it was revealed that Sam Wilson wasn't actually Sam Wilson, a social worker from New York with falconry skills. This was all a fabrication of the Red Skull, who had used the Cosmic Cube to turn him into the perfect partner for Captain America as part of an insidious plot. The true persona of Wilson was the criminal thug and pimp known as Snap Wilson. What? This would be revealed to Cap as being his true persona, which Cap would then save him from. Yikes. Fortunately, years later we would see a retcon that would basically undo this one, turning the fake persona of Sam Wilson into the real persona for him, and the originally retconned real persona of Snap Wilson into the fake, meaning that Sam Wilson was always Sam Wilson and Snap Wilson was the version created and used by Red Skull. Whew, thank goodness. Number 10. Hank Pym's secret daughter. Nadia Van Dyne is Hank's daughter, who we didn't know existed until 2016. She was introduced in a free comic book day issue about Civil War II. Now of course I like Nadia Van Dyne as a character, don't get me wrong, but her being added in retroactively as Hank's lost daughter was something that I felt like was a bit much. When we learned of Nadia's backstory, we learned that she was the daughter of Hank Pym and his first wife, Maria Travoia. Maria was kidnapped during her and Hank's honeymoon and killed. Nadia ended up being raised in Russia, trained in the Red Room. Eventually she escaped after learning of who her parents really were. By the time she got back to America though to see her father, Nadia learned of his sacrifice to save the world from Ultron and his death as a result. She decided to seek out her stepmother Janet Van Dyne and became close enough to her that she felt compelled to change her own last name to Van Dyne, because that's not confusing at all. She's Hank's daughter, she's not at all related to Janet, and yet she has her last name. Number 9. Falcon's X gene. Remember that time Falcon was revealed to be a mutant and then we explained that origin away with, a faulty Sentinel? If you don't, let me explain. In issue 174 of Captain America, we see Professor X meeting Falcon and Cap. Charles implied Falcon's connection to his bird seemed telepathic, and that Falcon's telepathic abilities may be mutant in origin. Falcon himself took this suggestion to heart and even considered what it might mean for him to be a mutant, pondering on his strong, seemingly psychic link to his bird Redwing. He then encountered a Sentinel who identified him as a mutant, and so he was a mutant for a time. This was established, and this wouldn't really be revisited or retouched till 2001. Where the idea of Falcon being a mutant was tossed in the trash and explained away as a Sentinel simply malfunctioning. Wah wah wah. Number 8. Black Widow's confusing backstory. Natasha being a mysterious spy from Russia who switched sides means that yes, we are going to get a complex backstory for her, but it actually wasn't always that complex. Natasha was inspired to fight for her nation originally when her husband was assumed dead in combat. Her husband wasn't really dead of course, and it was implied that this was all part of a plot to basically encourage her to fight for her country. Before that, Natasha was a renowned ballerina. Later on, however, this whole origin was revealed to be a lie when we learned that the Red Room had embedded memories of her being a ballerina in her mind. They made her think she had trained in ballet, but she hadn't really, because I guess that's what the Red Room does, they mess with you and give you fake memories. Her story was also changed from a woman who was inspired by her husband's sacrifice to put her own life on the line for her country as well, to that of a woman being blackmailed and threatened into becoming a spy in order to protect her husband. Number 7. Professor X married Mystique. Some retcons that are really strange come from film inspiration. As a lot of people discussed in the comments, many feel that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, for example, would still be mutants today if it wasn't for their being introduced in the MCU's Avengers franchise, which didn't have the rights to include mutants, so we had to kind of unmutant them. I feel as though the case was possibly similar for this weird, secret retcon. In 2013's Uncanny X-Men issue 24, we learned of Mystique and Charles Xavier's secret marriage, meaning that the child we saw Mystique gave birth to while in the guise of Moira McTaggart was likely one willfully conceived, as opposed to Mystique tricking Charles into sleeping with her, which would have been super weird and pretty not good in my opinion. In the X-Men prequel films such as First Class, which came out in 2011, we see a different kind of relationship between Raven and Charles. We get this weird love triangle between Charles, Raven, and Eric, and it seems more of that likely influenced this weird retcon plot point revealed in the comics, in Charles's will. Number 6. Thanos. Number 1 dad? Thanos has never really been known as a caring and kind person. Even the people he keeps close to him are never really fully safe from his wrath. Faithful servants, family members, to Thanos, everyone is pretty much disposable. The same could be said for his adopted daughter Gamora, who he hardened and transformed into a killer until she ended up later rebelling. In the 2019 Thanos series, however, we learn how Gamora's relationship with her father was, well, more complex. How he actually, in his own way, was kind of a good father to her. This series also highlights how much they both cared cared for each other, despite the fact that an Infinity Gauntlet, which happened in the 90s pre this series, but in terms of continuity would have taken place after this, Thanos seems to not show any regard for his adopted daughter's life. So it's kind of a retcon. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Number 5. Spider-Man's non-sister. So this is kind of another retcon that for me is similar to Nadia's. I like the idea of this character, but the whole story involving her is, well, it's pretty wacky. Teresa showed up in Amazing Spider-Man Family Business claiming to be Teresa Parker, Peter's sister. She believed she was the daughter of Richard and Mary Parker, Peter's parents, and we got a few cool adventures with her, assuming this belief to be true. She was retconned into existence, but honestly, I thought she was kind of a cool retcon to add in, so I was cool with that. However, things got weirder when we learned that the secret sister we'd never heard of till now was all a lie, and that Teresa actually wasn't who she said she was, despite what she herself had been manipulated to believe. It was all a trick, and Mentalo had manipulated Teresa into believing it herself. It was all part of Kingpin's plan to basically lure Peter to a tomb. And we don't actually even know who Teresa's parents are now. It's still a mystery. They even manipulated how Peter saw Teresa, making her appear more like him, so she'd look more like his sister. It's weird. I wish she was actually his sister. That would have been cooler, I think. Number 4. Spider Destiny. Now you know me, I love the Spider-Verse, I love spider totems, but not all fans share my bizarre obsession with the Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon stories and the villains known as the Inheritors. I swear I'm like the only person that really loves the Inheritors. If you also love them, let me know in the comments. Show yourselves. With these stories came a pretty huge retcon, which basically implied via learning about the Great Web and the spider totems placed within it that every spider, man, or person had a kind of destiny to become that spider person. In other words, Peter Parker didn't have a freak accident, he was actually destined to become Spider-Man. It was fate! Many fans were not a fan of this change to his origins, as they felt it detracted from what makes Peter Parker so appealing, that he's just an average kid who got a freak spider bite that gave him powers, as opposed to it being all ordained. Number 3. Kang. Sometimes we talk about retcons that are ridiculous because they hurt the overall story. Other times there are retcons that feel like they don't really need to happen, and then there are those that just cause more confusion than really necessary. That's sort of the case with Kang. Kang the Conqueror was a villain who was first introduced in Avengers issue 8 in 1964. He is known for being a time-traveling villain who enjoys sitting and floating around while menacing other people. As time went on, however, we'd come to discover, due to the fact that he's a time traveler, the Kang was actually a bunch of other people, including Immortus and even Iron Lad. While these retcons were sometimes interesting, they don't really add much to his story, and at this point Kang being revealed as just about anyone is so old hat, it's kind of lost its shock value as well. Now we're gonna get him in the MCU, I don't know what that's gonna be like. Could be weird, could be great. Number 2. Aunt May's death. Remember when Aunt May died, but it wasn't really Aunt May but an actress who had actually died while impersonating Aunt May? Yeah, that was a weird villainous plot. What we saw in the comics as an elderly Aunt May's death was later retconned into being one of the weirdest and most elaborate plots of Green Goblin's criminal career. It was later revealed that the woman who was dead and buried and who we thought had been Aunt May was actually an elderly actress who happened to be on her deathbed and who had agreed to take on one last role in order to torment Spider-Man? Prove how great of an actress she was? Her motives are pretty foggy. Maybe Green Goblin agreed to pay any surviving relatives of hers a ton of cash? I honestly don't know. What had really happened was this actress had been genetically altered to exactly match Aunt May's genes, meaning no one at the hospital suspected this imposter to be a fake. She died after revealing to Peter that she knew he was Spider-Man, and was even buried in Aunt May's intended plot next to Uncle Ben for a time. That is, of course, until we all learned that Aunt May was really still alive, and this had been some kind of bizarre ruse. Number 1. Clone Saga. I won't deny that in my time on this channel I've come to actually somewhat love elements of the Clone Saga. I originally disliked Clone Saga when I started working here, but I very much have come to appreciate parts of the story and to acknowledge that without Clone Saga, we wouldn't have some very awesome characters like Ben Reilly and Kane Parker. However, one thing I still cannot get over is how long Marvel spent tricking everyone with this story. People spent 20 years thereabouts thinking they were reading Spider-Man, as in Peter Parker, only to find out that all those stories were not his, but actually belonged to a clone. Granted, at least it was a pretty cool clone who we'd all come to love after. But at the time, this was a pretty shocking and frustrating revelation after years of stories, and it left a lot of fans feeling betrayed at the time.
In at number 10, Puck's Constant Pain. Puck is a character who was first introduced into Marvel Comics back in 1983's Alpha Flight issue 1. He's a 3'6" superhero named Eugene Judd, who initially, when created, had no superpowers at all. He was just exceptionally acrobatic and incredibly skilled at combat, and was always armed with a good sense of humor. To make things more interesting though, the character suffered from constant pain thanks to a condition called achondroplasia, which often is correlated with dwarfism. But as time went on, Puck's origins were retconned, and when Bill Mantlo took over Alpha Flight, he decided to give a new meaning to Puck's aching. The retcon made it so that his small stature was due to a mystical influence. Puck once upon a time was 7 feet tall according to this retcon, an adventurer who stumbled upon something called the Black Blade of Baghdad, which contained the spirit of an evil sorcerer named Razar. Judd accidentally freed him, but trapped him using some sort of ancient mysticism, which basically put Razar inside of his own body, trapped for an eternity, causing him non-stop pain that eventually caused him to shrink down physically, but also made him immortal. So, he went from regular guy to someone walking around as a living prison for a mystical evil sorcerer. Yeah, that seems like it makes the most sense, doesn't it? In at number 9, Zorn was Magneto all along. But he was also Zorn again. In 2001, Marvel brought in Grant Morrison to reinvent the X-Men, and amongst the many new aspects he introduced, he also introduced a highly controversial character named Zorn. Why was Zorn controversial? Well, initially he was a Chinese mutant who wore a skull mask that found his way out of prison and into Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, where he worked as a teacher. At the end of Morrison's run, he revealed that Zorn was in fact Magneto all along, who prior was presumed to have been dead. Zornito, as I will call him for the rest of this list, went on a massacre in New York and ended up getting into a full-on brawl with the X-Men and was killed off again, all as some beaten-to-death metaphor to symbolize the end of an era. After Morrison left, Marvel retconned the storyline, revealing that this Zornito was actually just a Magneto imposter himself, and that the real Magneto was alive and innocent. Eventually, they introduced a second Zorn, who was a twin to the original Zorn, and instead of having a star where his head should be, hence the mask, he had a black hole where his head should be. Look, they're different. And to make matters worse, there was no actual connection between Zorn and Magneto for any of this to be justified. It's noted in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, X-Men 2005, that this happened all thanks to Scarlet Witch meddling with reality prior to the House of M event. Confused? Yeah, most people still are when it comes to this retcon too. What did Magneto ever do to get dragged into this crap? And at number 8, Scarlet Witch's kids. I feel like the only sacred thing when it comes to Wanda Maximoff's family life is that she is a twin and that her brother is Quicksilver. Seriously, don't even get us started on the whole Magneto isn't actually her father debacle. So let's try to not make this confusing. Wanda, aka Scarlet Witch, once upon a time had twin sons named Wiccan and Speed. They became members of the Young Avengers. Vision was their father. Yes, he's a robot, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Wanda believed she had these two children with Vision until it was revealed that they were actually created by her reality warping abilities. Makes sense, cause you know, Vision is a robot. Anywho, it just gets worse from there. Wiccan and Speed are apparently made from 2 pieces of Mephisto's soul, who then tried to reabsorb those pieces, which then reincarnated Wiccan and Speed into Billy Kaplan and Thomas Shepard. The whole thing is just very, very confusing. Moral of the story? Hide your kids? And at number 7, Jean Grey was never Phoenix. The Phoenix Saga, and Jean Grey by association, is perhaps one of the most iconic and recognized X-Men stories to date, and according to this retcon, it's also pretty meaningless. You all likely know the story. Jean is possessed by the Phoenix Force, a powerful cosmic entity that consumes her and ends up getting a bunch of people killed, including herself. By the end of this year, there will officially be 2 live-action movies that have followed that storyline. After Scott attempted to move on by shacking up with the literal clone of Jean Grey, Madeline Pryor, it was revealed that, surprise, Jean was actually alive. The Phoenix Force had apparently preserved her body in an underwater cocoon, but then it turned out that she wasn't the Phoenix at all. And then Jean just kept dying and coming back and dying and coming back, and who knows what's what anymore. So yeah, Jean's big sacrifice in killing herself in order to prevent the Dark Phoenix from destroying the entire universe is kind of pointless. Sorry guys. Some serious nihilism going on over at Marvel, I suppose. They just keep wanting to end the universe and then like, psych, it's not gonna end, but I guess, you know, that's comics. And at number 6, the Spider God. What's one way to piss fans off? Retcon an origin story that's over half a century old, and toss in a terrifyingly large and powerful spider into the mix while you're at it. Obviously, we are talking about Spider-Man here. In the controversial Spider-Man The Other story arc, it's revealed that Peter Parker was actually chosen by a spider god to become the web-slinging hero, which, yes, in case you're wondering, makes zero sense. Thanks to J. Michael Straczynski, the Spider God, a totemic god, quietly manipulated Peter's actions and went on to give him new powers as well, which allowed him to communicate with arthropods, have a poisonous bite, and, get this, wrist stingers. Best part was, this was never mentioned again, ever. Fans hated it, and it's also one of the reasons that our next retcon on our list was brought into the fray. And at number 5, Spider-Man One More Day. Yet another wonderful retcon thanks to J. Michael Straczynski here, and Joe Quesada. So the One Day More story arc is the famous controversial story arc in which after Peter's identity is revealed publicly, Aunt May ends up getting fatally injured. In order to save her, Peter strikes up a deal with Mephisto, one of Marvel's best narrative tools when it comes to retcons, who agrees to let Aunt May live if Peter gives up his life with Mary Jane Watson. Peter does it, dissolving their marriage. It's the product of that lame cliche that superheroes don't deserve to be happily married. Anywho, the decision cost Peter his future daughter, who he got a glimpse of throughout. But it reset a lot of aspects of Parker's life, and involved a terrifying demon in order to do so. It's stupid and scary. And at number 4, Sentry. Sentry's story is a little terrifying. Sentry's story starts off with the alias of the character, a man named Robert, remembering that he was once a superhero. He realizes that no one else remembers him being an active superhero, and the deeper the narrative dives, the more we learn about this life that Robert, aka Sentry, had in the Marvel Universe. Turns out, Sentry has an evil other half living within him. That, with the scope of the powers that he has, was a supreme threat to the Marvel Universe. So Sentry, with the help of Reed Richards, ended up having everyone on Earth's memory of him erased, including his own. Essentially, his whole story was a massive retcon in order to introduce a character and squeeze him into previous storylines that had already existed in Marvel's history. It's one of the less painful retcons on this list, since it is doing something interesting with the narrative, but perhaps the scariest part of Sentry's entire story is how horrifying his other half, Void, truly is, and why he would go to those lengths to forever suppress him. And at number 3, Karen Page. Are you guys familiar with Women in Refrigerators? It was a website started back in 1999 by author Gail Simone that highlighted all of the ways that female characters had been mistreated in comics. It had become a trope. The female characters were often used to progress a male character's narrative, and were subject to brutal murders, intense injuries, rape, or were just flat out depowered. Anywho, the exact concept can be applied to this ridiculous retcon surrounding Daredevil's lady pal Karen Page. Karen was given some pretty crappy treatment. She was made into a prostitute, was given AIDS, which turns out was all an illusion thanks to Mysterio, and then died in Matt Murdock's arms after Bullseye killed her. All in all, Karen was retconned from a character who went to California and began a successful acting career to a character who became addicted to heroin and starred in pornos. From Daredevil issue 227 onwards, it just gets worse and worse for Karen. Poor girl. And at number 2, HYDRA Cap. HYDRA Cap is the most recent retcon on this list. So in 2017, there was a series called Captain America Steve Rogers that set the foundation for some major reveals concerning Steve Rogers' origin story. We learned that he had been a sleeper agent all along for HYDRA, and was basically a Nazi who stood against everything the character ever stood for. It was ludicrous. He ends up starting this whole war with him working with HYDRA for global dominance, and it's later revealed that it wasn't actually Steve Rogers. Instead, the culprit behind this was an alternate timeline HYDRA duplicate of Rogers. But considering the political climate that the series was released during, needless to say, making the epitome of American patriotism a fascist was a little on the nose there, Marvel. And finally, in at number 1, Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn got it on. This one is actually really terrible. It seems like poor Peter Parker gets the worst of the retcons, doesn't he? Or maybe they're just all penned by J. Michael Straczynski and that's why they all suck. Might be that. This retcon in the story arc since past added a lot of unnecessary details and motivation behind the events of the famous 1973 The Amazing Spider-Man, the night Gwen Stacy died storyline. After a pair of twins attack Spider-Man, Peter later finds out that they're actually Gwen Stacy's children, who are out to kill Peter for revenge. MJ would break the news to Peter, telling her that Stacy had confided in her. Stacy slept with Norman Osborn and gave birth to his twin children in France shortly before she died. The reason why Osborn went after her that night was because she was a threat to his potential heirs, because she wanted to raise his children with Peter instead. He was going after both Peter and Gwen that night. Still, the panels in which we see Osborn get freaky with Gwen are, well, not great. They kind of burn themselves into your retinas. Sorry, I am so sorry.